We have to find and look at different practices of different people, or different commoners, all over the world, in thinking about different epistemic spaces from which we can learn. We need to, again, I come back to this idea of ecology of knowledge. Look not only to scientific knowledge, but to scientific knowledge is only one possible knowledge, to many heterogeneous forms of knowledge, to plural landscape of knowledge, to embrace fully all of those knowledges, all of those political practices that have been subalternized, that have been erased, that have been destroyed on the other side of this global capitalist modern wall that was built in the 16th century. And I think only that, when we go beyond this, we are going to be able to build a truly global world. We're going to be able to deliver the promise that Iain was talking about. World Social Forum, and this is something we can talk about, for me still represents the most hopeful sign, with all of its problems, and there are many problems about and around World Social Forum, of actually creating this situation. And what is most important for me, and I will conclude for now with this, there is no global social justice without global cognitive justice. There can't be any kind of political resistance without epistemological resistance, resistance in the field of knowledge. And we need to be serious about this. We need to start thinking outside of the United States, outside of nationalist boundaries. We need to have an idea of modernity that is not built around European reformers, industrial, French and other revolutions, but actually around conquest, coloniality, established since 1492. We need to think and we need to destroy the myth of modernity by looking at the underside of modernity. And Nick Dussel calls this transmodern project, transmodernity. All of these people who were excluded and who are now even more excluded in the conditions of imperial globality, global coloniality, under the conditions of social fascism. So we can talk more about this, but
yeah, I'll pick that up. Thank you. So, Afflicted Powers begins with the memory of those 2 days as the sun swept around the globe, with millions of people came into the streets of the world trying to stop the war before it started. At a moment that is normally the state's finest hour, when the state whips up an attack dog combination of fear, aggressivity, xenophobia. And millions of people simply refused to believe what the warlords were telling them. Now, of course, it failed in that sense. It failed to stop the war. But we wanted to start with that. The book ends by saying that one of the lessons from that moment is that actually there was a movement of movement, there is a movement of movement, coalescing perhaps, but that it cannot do so unless we essentially challenge modernity itself. This is difficult because almost, the history of the last 100 years of resistance to capitalist modernity is also done, as it were, under the sign of modernity. Socialists have, when writing about peasantries and commoners, take Eric Hobsbawm, still alive and writing in his 90s, a very distinguished historian, and wrote a magnificent book, The Age of Extremes. Nevertheless, he never saw a peasant that he didn't wish into extinction. The commons of the world. And if you look at most socialist tracts, communist tracts, because of the greed and egotism of commoners who will want to put an extra cow, an extra sheep, whatever, it will always destroy the commons. It was written out of complete ignorance of the history of commoning, which is the history of most of humanity, right? So, for example, when the ideologues and founders of modernity, of capitalist modernity, began their project, there was a corresponding articulation of the denigration of comedy. These are still the fundamental texts taught in schools, right? John Locke, Francis Bacon. Bacon writes a manifesto for empire, in which Ireland is a laboratory for the new world. The new technologies of empire are being developed in the 17th century. The survey, the cadastral survey. When you fly over North America, you see that. There it is beneath you. The gridding out of North America using the theodolite and so on. The whole continent of commoning cultures, which did not know private property, especially the property in land. And of course, there is resistance always. But that, again, the story of that resistance is told in such a way that it's inevitably a story of failure. At the beginning of the 19th century, in 1812, the first generation of those resisting the incarceration of production into the factories, the Luddites, are resisting. There are more troops out actually against the Luddites in Britain than there are against Napoleon, interestingly. It's a serious threat to the project of capitalist modernity and the incarceration of production. At the same time, the English state is actually arming, for their own strategic reasons, the Native American resistance, led by a magnificent young warrior, Tecumseh, who understands that they're not going to stop as the Anglos punch their way over the Appalachian crest for the gridding out, for the modernization of North America. And he tells the elders, we've got to stop them here. And he imagines a resistance all the way from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf, in which they will hold the Anglos. So these two figures of resistance to modernity, the Native Americans and the Luddites, are seen as figures of hopelessness, right? And the same story is told about the Luddites. Even the historian of the Luddites, the last historian of Luddites, Kirkpatrick Sale, wrote a book which he got mostly accurate, right? It's called Rebels Against the Future. This is grotesque. They were not rebels against the future. These were skilled weavers. First of all, they were not rebels against the future. In fact, they were rebelling against the foreclosure of the future and the immiseration of their children in the factories, right? A. And B. I'm in a lot of Rolodexes as mindless Luddite, right? I wrote a book, at the height of the cyber hype in the mid-90s called Resisting a Virtual Life, and I was on TV and things talking to people who were labeled as, technology enthusiasts. The idea that the Luddites were mindless smashers of machinery. These were skilled artisans, for God's sake. They were often innovators. Certainly they smashed the looms, but often they would smash the old looms and leave the new ones intact. How can you understand that, explain that, if they're, as it were, against technology, whatever that could mean? Like what, no clothing, no shelter? Well, it's interesting. It depended on the social relations of production. If the machinery was being ganged up in factories, and they were losing control of production, that's what they were against. They were not against new machines necessarily.